The year was 1941. Summer approached, cloaking the vast plains of Eastern Europe in a deceptive serenity. A deceptive serenity, for beneath the tranquil surface, a tempest was brewing, a cataclysm poised to erupt and engulf the world in its fiery embrace. On the 22nd day of June, the storm broke. No gentle summer rain, this. It was a hurricane of steel and fire, unleashed upon the unsuspecting lands of the Soviet Union. Unternehmen Barbarossa, they called it. A campaign envisioned to reshape the geopolitical landscape of the world. A campaign, many believed, that would decide the fate of the Second World War. The initial hours, the first weeks, unfolded with breathtaking, almost terrifying speed. The German panzer divisions, those iron behemoths of war, surged eastward, unstoppable it seemed, carving deep wounds into the Soviet defences. The Luftwaffe, masters of the skies, reigned supreme, casting long, ominous shadows over the retreating columns of the Red Army. Encirclement battles, vast and merciless, became the hallmark of the offensive. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, caught in the Wehrmacht's iron grip, were killed, captured, or simply vanished, swallowed whole by the insatiable maw of war. Victory, swift and decisive, appeared imminent. Germany, flush with triumphs won in France and the Low Countries, seemed poised to deliver another crushing blow, to bring the Soviet Union to its knees in a matter of weeks. Yet, the Soviet Union did not crumble. The edifice so confidently predicted to collapse with a single forceful kick stubbornly refused to fall. Despite staggering losses, despite the initial shock and disorientation, the will to resist remained unbroken, a smouldering ember of defiance that slowly, painstakingly, began to rekindle into a raging inferno. The German advance, initially a lightning strike, began to slow, to bog down in the vastness of the Eastern Front. Casualties mounted, the relentless pressure began to tell, and the spectre of a protracted attritional conflict loomed large on the horizon, a conflict Germany was ill-prepared to wage. The vanguard of the German forces, exhausted and depleted, reached the outskirts of Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union, its ancient capital. 20 miles. A mere 20 miles separated them from their ultimate objective, from the culmination of their grand design. 20 miles, but it proved to be an insurmountable chasm. As the Germans dug in, preparing for the final assault, the Soviets launched a sudden, ferocious counterattack, catching the invaders completely off guard. The attack was a desperate gamble, a last-ditch effort to stave off defeat, but it worked. The German offensive stalled, then faltered, then finally buckled under the weight of the Soviet onslaught. For the first time in the Second World War, Adolf Hitler suffered a decisive defeat on land, a defeat that would shatter the aura of invincibility surrounding the Wehrmacht and, ultimately, set in motion the events that would lead to the downfall of the Third Reich. The question then arose, the question that historians would debate for decades to come. How had it happened? Why had Operation Barbarossa, so meticulously planned, so brilliantly executed in its initial stages, fallen short of its ultimate objective? Why had the seemingly invincible German war machine stumbled and faltered at the very gates of Moscow? The answer, as always, was complex, multifaceted, and deeply rooted in the ideological and strategic miscalculations that underpinned the entire enterprise. The seeds of destruction, it could be argued, were sown long before the first shots were fired on that fateful day in June. They were sown in the twisted ideology of National Socialism, in the hubris of its leader, and in the fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy they were about to confront. Adolf Hitler, even before the dust had settled on the battlefields of France, began to contemplate the invasion of the Soviet Union. As early as July 1940, while the Battle of Britain raged in the skies above England, he was already sketching out the broad outlines of Operation Barbarossa. This ambition was not merely a strategic calculation, it was an article of faith, a core tenet of his warped worldview, a worldview forged in the crucible of the trenches of the First World War and hardened by years of political struggle and ideological fanaticism. In the depths of his mind, even back in the mid-1920s, when he was a mere political agitator languishing in prison, the invasion of the Soviet Union was not just a possibility, it was an inevitability, the cornerstone of his grand vision for a 1,000-year Reich. This was to be the battleground on which the ideology of National Socialism would either triumph or be utterly destroyed. The ultimate test of its validity, its power, and its destiny. One of the central pillars of that ideology was the concept of Lebensraum, or living space, the expansion of the German nation eastward into the vast, fertile lands of Eastern Europe. This was not simply about territorial expansion, it was about the creation of a vast, self-sufficient Germanic Aryan empire, an empire that would provide the resources and manpower necessary to secure Germany's dominance over the continent and eventually the world. The Slavic populations of Eastern Europe deemed racially inferior would be subjugated, displaced, or even exterminated, making way for the superior Germanic race. The rich agricultural lands of Ukraine, the vast mineral resources of Russia, would be seized and exploited to fuel the German war machine and to provide the German people with the living space they so desperately craved. Having swiftly and decisively defeated France and the Low Countries in a matter of weeks, the German leadership was brimming with confidence, convinced that the Soviet Union would prove to be an equally easy target. Hitler, in particular, held the Soviet Union in utter contempt. He viewed the communist society as fundamentally weak, politically unstable, and militarily inept. He believed that the Red Army, still reeling from the purges of the 1930s, was a hollow shell, incapable of mounting a serious defence. His famous quote, uttered with characteristic arrogance and certainty, was that all we have to do is kick the door in, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. This profound underestimation of the Soviet Union's resilience, its resources, and its will to fight would prove to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations of the entire war. The Germans envisioned a swift, decisive blitzkrieg campaign, a lightning war that would knock the Soviet Union out of the conflict in a matter of 6 to 8 weeks. Time was of the essence. Germany could not afford a prolonged attritional war on the Eastern Front. Its reserves of manpower and material were simply not sufficient to sustain such a conflict. A swift victory was essential, a knockout blow that would cripple the Soviet Union, secure Germany's eastern flank, and allow it to turn its full attention to the remaining threats in the West. As such, the planning and execution of Operation Barbarossa were predicated on the assumption of a rapid, decisive victory, an assumption that would ultimately prove to be fatally flawed. To achieve that swift victory, Germany amassed the largest invasion force in the history of warfare, a colossal juggernaut of men and machines poised to unleash its fury upon the unsuspecting Soviet Union. Over 3 million soldiers, tens of thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, and thousands of aircraft were assembled along the eastern border, ready to strike at a moment's notice. The invasion force was divided into 3 massive army groups, each with its own distinct objective. Army Group North, under the command of Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, was tasked with capturing the Baltic states and advancing on Leningrad, the second largest city in the Soviet Union, and a vital industrial and cultural centre. Army Group Center, the largest and most powerful of the 3, under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was assigned the primary objective, to drive directly towards Moscow, crushing all resistance along the way and toppling the Soviet government. Army Group South, under the command of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was tasked with conquering Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and seizing its vital industrial resources. The overall strategy was a continuation of the blitzkrieg tactics that had proven so devastatingly effective in France and Poland, a strategy based on speed, surprise, and overwhelming firepower. The goal was to shatter the Soviet defences encircle and destroy large formations of enemy troops, and advance rapidly into the interior, disrupting the enemy's ability to organize a coherent resistance. The underlying principle was to win by, not fighting, to overwhelm the enemy so completely that they would be unable to mount a sustained defense. The German planners believed that the Soviet Union was a brittle structure, ready to crumble at the first sign of weakness, that a swift, decisive blow would be enough to shatter its will to resist and to bring the entire edifice crashing down. When Operation Barbarossa commenced on the 22nd of June, the initial results were nothing short of spectacular. The blitzkrieg tactics worked flawlessly. The German advance exceeded all expectations. The Soviet defences, caught completely by surprise, crumbled under the weight of the German onslaught. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were encircled and captured. German tanks steamed through the Soviet lines, almost unopposed, and the Luftwaffe reigned supreme in the skies, wreaking havoc on Soviet airfields and supply lines. The Germans had achieved complete tactical surprise. The Soviets were completely unprepared for the scale and ferocity of the attack. One of the keys to the German success in the opening days of the campaign was the destruction of the Soviet air force on the ground. In a series of carefully coordinated airstrikes, the Luftwaffe decimated the Soviet airfields, destroying hundreds of aircraft before they even had a chance to take off. This gave the Germans complete air superiority, allowing their tanks and infantry to move freely across the battlefield without fear of aerial attack. The Soviet army was taken completely by surprise. It had not had time to fortify its new border in Poland, and its defensive positions were woefully inadequate to withstand the German onslaught. The speed and ferocity of the German attack overwhelmed the Soviet defences, and the Red Army was thrown into a state of chaos and disarray. Stalin's purges of the Soviet officer corps in the 1930s had left the Red Army poorly led and demoralised. Many of the most experienced and capable officers had been executed or imprisoned, replaced by political appointees who lacked the necessary skills and experience to command effectively. This leadership vacuum contributed significantly to the initial Soviet defeats. The Red Army simply lacked the leadership necessary to coordinate a coherent defence and to effectively counter the German blitzkrieg. Whereas in the Battle of France, the French and British armies, upon realising that they were about to be cut off, would initiate a timely retreat. The Soviet armies were too slow, too poorly led, to react effectively to the German encirclements. They were encircled, cut off, and destroyed in vast numbers, losing hundreds of thousands of men in a matter of weeks. However, beneath the surface of these initial successes, a fundamental problem was beginning to emerge, a problem that would ultimately undermine the entire German war effort. The Germans had completely underestimated the size and resilience of the Soviet army. They had expected to destroy the main Soviet field armies in the initial weeks of the campaign, and to then face only a token resistance on the road to Moscow. They had invaded with approximately 3 million men, and they had expected the total strength of the Soviet army to be roughly the same. However, by Christmas 1941, the German armies had captured over 3 million Soviet soldiers, and they were still fighting, still facing a seemingly endless stream of fresh Soviet divisions. The Soviet Union possessed vast reserves of manpower, reserves that the Germans had completely failed to account for in their initial calculations. The vast distances covered by the German panzer divisions also began to create logistical problems. The German supply line, stretched thin across the vast expanse of the Eastern Front, became increasingly vulnerable to Soviet partisan attacks, and the further the German troops advanced, the more difficult it became to supply them with the food, fuel and ammunition they needed to sustain their offensive. The Soviet soldiers unexpectedly continued to fight even when encircled and cut off from their main forces. These large encirclements behind the German lines became a serious problem, as they could attack the German lines of communication, cutting off the front-line troops from their vital supplies. At this point, Hitler intervened. Against the advice of his generals, he ordered Army Group Center to halt its advance on Moscow, and to instead divert its forces to the north and south to help destroy the remaining Soviet pockets of resistance. This decision, though seemingly logical at the time, proved to be a strategic blunder. It gave the Soviets a crucial breathing space, allowing them to reinforce their defences around Moscow and to prepare for the next German offensive. The pause also allowed the Soviets to redeploy troops from other sectors of the front and to bring up fresh divisions from the Far East. Divisions that were better equipped and better trained than the troops that had been decimated in the initial weeks of the campaign. By mid-September, the main Soviet field armies had been largely destroyed, and the drive on Moscow could begin once again. However, the pause had given the Soviets valuable time to regroup and to prepare a new defensive line in front of Moscow. This new defensive line, though hastily constructed and manned by largely inexperienced troops, presented a formidable obstacle to the advancing German forces. The Germans now faced a completely new challenge. They had to break through a prepared defensive line, manned by fresh troops, in order to reach their ultimate objective, the capture of Moscow. The delay in the advance on Moscow was not the only problem facing the German war effort. The new Soviet troops, though undersupplied and undertrained, were arriving in increasing numbers, bolstering the Soviet defences and providing a much-needed infusion of manpower. Many of these new divisions lacked proper uniforms. They were often dressed in civilian clothes, armed with whatever weapons were available. In some cases, several soldiers had to share a single rifle. Despite these deficiencies, these new troops were a welcome addition to the Soviet ranks, and they helped to stiffen the resistance against the advancing Germans. At the same time, the first Arctic convoys were arriving in Murmansk and Archangel, bringing vital supplies from the United Kingdom. These convoys, braving the perilous journey through the icy waters of the Arctic Ocean, delivered much-needed equipment, including tanks, trucks, and ammunition, providing the Soviets with just enough resources to stay in the field. The supplies from Britain, though limited in quantity, were crucial in helping the Soviets to sustain their resistance and to prevent the complete collapse of their war effort. On top of that, the Soviets had managed to relocate many of their factories from the western regions of the country, ahead of the advancing Germans, to the Ural Mountains in the east. This massive industrial relocation, carried out under extremely difficult conditions, was a testament to the resilience and determination of the Soviet people. It allowed the Soviets to maintain their war production and to continue to produce tanks, aircraft, and other essential war materials. The relocation of the factories was a major logistical achievement, and it played a crucial role in enabling the Soviets to withstand the German onslaught. The Soviet factories were soon churning out new tanks, including the T-34, a revolutionary design that outclassed most of the German tanks. The T-34 was a formidable weapon, combining excellent firepower, mobility, and armour protection. Its sloped armour made it difficult to penetrate, and its powerful gun could easily destroy most German tanks. The appearance of the T-34 on the battlefield came as a shock to the Germans, who had previously enjoyed a clear technological advantage in armoured warfare. The T-34 helped to level the playing field, and it played a crucial role in slowing down the German advance. Worst of all for the Germans, however, was the rapidly deteriorating Russian weather. As October approached, the Soviet autumn descended upon the Eastern Front, bringing with it torrential rains, thick mud, and eventually the first snowfalls. The Soviet autumn, known as the Rasputitsa, transformed the roads into quagmires, making it almost impossible for vehicles to move. The German offensive ground to a halt as tanks and trucks became bogged down in the mud and supply lines were stretched to breaking point. The weather, which the Germans had completely failed to anticipate, proved to be a more formidable enemy than the Red Army. The German offensive began to falter, not only because of the new Soviet defensive line and the deteriorating weather, but also because the German formations, particularly the armoured formations at the tip of the spear, had been severely depleted by months of intense fighting. Many German units were now operating at only 50% strength. Their tanks and vehicles were worn out, their crews were exhausted, and their morale was beginning to suffer. The Blitzkrieg, which had been so successful in the initial stages of the campaign, had lost its momentum. The German war machine was beginning to run out of steam. By late November, the vanguard of the German forces had reached within 20 kilometers of Moscow. They could see the spires of the Kremlin in the distance, but they were unable to advance any further. The weather had turned completely. It was now full-blown Soviet winter, with freezing temperatures, heavy snowfalls and icy winds. The German soldiers, who had not been adequately equipped for the harsh winter conditions, suffered terribly from frostbite and exposure. By the end of November, more German troops were in hospital with frostbite than with gunshot wounds. The offensive was over. The German advance had stalled, just short of its ultimate objective. Looking at the overall picture as Operation Barbarossa came to a halt, Germany still seemed to be in a relatively strong position. Army Group North had encircled Leningrad and was confident that the besieged city was about to fall. Army Group Center was at the gates of Moscow, poised to launch a final assault on the Soviet capital. Army Group South had conquered Ukraine and had seized its vital industrial resources. The German leadership planned to resume the offensive in the new year and to finally finish the job of defeating the Soviet Union. However, little did they know that the Soviets had an ace up their sleeve. They had managed to transfer the majority of their divisions from the eastern side of the Soviet Union, those that had been facing Mongolia and the Japanese, to the front lines around Moscow. These were not green, untrained troops. They were seasoned veterans, many of whom had been trained for winter warfare in the harsh conditions of Siberia. Unlike the exhausted and ill-equipped Germans, these troops had winter camouflage, warm clothing, and weapons that could function in the extreme cold. They were fresh, well-prepared, and eager to fight. On December 6th, the Soviets launched their counter-offensive, a massive coordinated attack all along the front lines around Moscow. The attack caught the Germans completely by surprise, shattering their overconfidence and forcing them onto the defensive. The Soviet troops, invigorated by the arrival of fresh reinforcements and the onset of winter, fought with a renewed determination. They pushed back the exhausted and demoralized Germans, recapturing villages and towns that had been occupied for months. The German lines began to buckle under the weight of the Soviet onslaught, and the spectre of defeat loomed large on the horizon. The Soviet counter-offensive was a stunning success, completely reversing the momentum of the war. The Germans, who had been on the verge of capturing Moscow, were now in full retreat, desperately trying to hold on to their positions and to avoid being encircled and destroyed. The Soviet counter-offensive marked the end of Operation Barbarossa and the beginning of a new phase of the war, a phase in which the initiative would gradually shift from the Germans to the Soviets. Hitler's ideological assumption that Soviet society would collapse when they kicked the door in could not have been further from the truth. The Soviet Union, despite suffering enormous losses, had not only survived the initial German onslaught, but had also managed to mount a powerful counter-offensive, driving the invaders back from the gates of Moscow. The Soviet people, far from collapsing under the weight of the German invasion, had rallied to the defense of their homeland, displaying a remarkable resilience and determination. The Germans had needed a quick victory, but the Soviets had managed to stay in the fight, turning the blitzkrieg of Operation Barbarossa into a war of attrition, a long, grinding and costly conflict that Germany was ill-equipped to wage. The Germans were now being forced into a war of production, a war of material, a war in which they would ultimately be outmatched by the vast resources and industrial capacity of the Soviet Union and its allies. The war on the Eastern Front was transforming into a titanic struggle of attrition, a struggle that would ultimately determine the fate of the Third Reich. Things were looking increasingly dire for the Germans. They lacked the manpower and material resources to effectively confront the Soviet armies on a one-to-one basis. The Soviet Union, bolstered by supplies from its allies, was steadily increasing its military strength, while the German war machine was beginning to show signs of wear and tear. The Eastern Front was consuming vast quantities of men and resources, diverting them from other theatres of the war and weakening the overall German war effort. Despite the failure of Operation Barbarossa to achieve its initial objectives, the German leadership remained stubbornly optimistic. They refused to acknowledge the gravity of the situation, and they continued to cling to the hope that they could somehow snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. In 1942, they launched a new offensive on the Eastern Front, targeting the Caucasus region in the south and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. The German generals wanted to resume the push on Moscow, believing that the capture of the Soviet capital would still be decisive. However, Hitler insisted that Germany needed the oil fields of Azerbaijan, which were vital to fueling its war machine. He had come to realize that the war on the Eastern Front was now a war of attrition, a war of material, and that control of vital resources was essential to winning the conflict. Whether his generals understood it or not, this decision signaled a profound shift in strategy, a tacit acknowledgement that the blitzkrieg tactics of 1941 had failed